You know those seasons of life, the ones where it seems like nothing you do is working. You can't seem to make progress. Those seasons when it just seems like you're just barely hanging on. And God, where are you and what are we doing here? Those seasons that seem like they're never going to end, and you see no light at the end of the tunnel. You see no way out. Could it be that that season has a purpose? Welcome to God Powered. Now, there's one concept I find more people find intimidating than just about any. And that's the idea that God would take you and I to the desert place, to the wilderness, whatever term you want to put on it, that He would take us there. And when there, it feels like it's either punishment or it seems like it's never going to end. It feels like this is permanent. Is this what life is like now? But the reality is, the wilderness is the place where God prepares and refines and tests His people for what He's called them to. When He drew His people out of Egypt, in the process of taking them to the promised land, their inheritance, He took them to the wilderness, and it was not punishment, but rather it was a season of preparation. And we're going to look at that a little bit more in just a second. But He even took Jesus to the wilderness. But when we're in it, it feels like it's never going to end. And why? See, what we're learning here, this is the place where the reality of God and His call on my life and your life, it meets the empowering that we need to fulfill what He has for us to do. But that empowering only happens when our utter reliance on Him is truly manifested in our lives. Now, the wilderness is a temporary transition point in the preparation for you and I to move into and to fulfill all that He's called us to do. In the process, just like we saw with His people when He brought them out of Egypt, He allows us to get to a place in the wilderness where we run out of our provision. We can't rely on our provision, our strength, our strategy, and we are learning in that place that utter reliance on Him. You can't figure it out. You can't strategize your way out. Now, here's the good news. When God is taking, and we have to remind ourselves of this, when God takes us to that wilderness place, to that desert place, here's the good news. That means God is preparing you and I for the next season of life. And because we need to see that utter, true reliance on Him fully manifested in our life, it means God has something greater in that next season of life. So while it's intimidating, while it feels never ending, while it can seem confusing, the reality is that desert place is a place where God is drawing you and I not just to a greater reliance on Him, but He's also calling us closer to Him. So the good news is, it's a clear indication of God's favor on my life and your life. It's not a punishment, but rather this is God's favor as He empowers you and I to fulfill the call He's given you and I. But let's talk about where we fail. Now, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, if you want to take a look at it, it talks about how God brought all of His people out of Egypt. They all were led by the cloud. They were all fed, and all their provision was given by God. But it says that God was not pleased with all of them, and many fell by the wayside. So what happens? That season of preparation, when you and I are in the wilderness, the desert place, this is our opportunity to put our frustration, our challenges, our thoughts on hold, and just draw closer to Him. This is our opportunity to learn a deeper degree of trust. Because when we go back to 1 Corinthians 10, what we see is, you and I know from the story, there were those who, in spite of the uncertainty, see, one of the things about the desert place is the tremendous uncertainty. How long will this last? Will this ever end? How will we do this? How will we pay the bills? How will we whatever? See, that uncertainty is God placing us in that arena where we must trust Him and rely on Him. And we know, again, from the story, we see how there were those who were fully committed to the Lord, and even when they didn't understand, they fully believed Him. Now remember, they had a promise. God told them from the beginning and repeatedly, He was taking them to the promised land. He identified exactly what He was going to do for them. The uncertainty was, how long was it going to take to get there? But God purposely, again, took them to the wilderness, that place where they ran out of their provision, so that He could provide for them. He was teaching them to trust Him because they would need that degree of trust to overcome the challenges to obtain their inheritance. Why have I got this in the More Than Conquerors series? See, you and I have great and precious promises. We have even better promises than they have. But this is where we have to have that more than conqueror mindset, that in spite of the uncertainty, in spite of the things we don't understand, that we can rest in the assurance that He has us in His hands. That those decisions that need to be made where we are completely unsure of what to do, that God will guide. Going back to 1 Corinthians 10, it goes on and it talks about so many died in the wilderness. Why? Because they didn't trust Him. What do we do in the wilderness? We learn to rely on Him. We learn to trust Him. We learn to sacrifice our thoughts, desires, and truly learn to trust Him. Now, real quickly, and I recommend if you get a chance, go look at 1 Corinthians 10, because what do we see? Rather than truly learning to trust Him, they looked everywhere else for something to make them happy, to give them fulfillment, to move them on. It says that many of them chased after idols. Many of them tried to fulfill the desires of the flesh, anything to feel better, anything that rather than just learning to trust God. They complained, they tested God. There's a tendency when we're in that desert place, out of frustration, out of uncertainty, to say and do things that we may regret later. But the reality is this. Again, being more than a conqueror is a mindset. In spite of the uncertainty, especially that uncertainty, God, what comes out of this? How long does this last? My encouragement to you is this. God takes each one of us to that desert place. And again, it's not a punishment and it's not permanent. But rather, this is the place where that call, the reality of the call that God has on your life, and He does have a call for you. He has a call for each one of His people, and it's individual and unique, and this is where that call is refined. This is where that reliance is made fully manifest. So what's the only thing we can do when we're in the wilderness? We can embrace it. We can embrace it. We can embrace Him, pursue Him, put aside those. This is where we become more than a conqueror. How? Because we're putting aside the doubt, the doubts, the frustrations, the uncertainties. We put those out of our mind and we focus wholly on Him.